just to ask you a little bit more about process and your process of writing this book and your intellectual interlocutors, right? You talked about Daria being an important figure for you. Were there particular archives or archivists that were revelatory for you? Were there people like Serhii Plohi with whom you were in contact who were helpful for you in orienting you and how you were producing this book?
Yeah, so Serhii was very helpful from the beginning, not just because of, he's not an expert on the famine, actually. That's not his great, um, passion. He writes, but he has a very, what's really important about him is he's a very sort of distant, although he's a very passionate, patriotic Ukrainian, he's nevertheless able to be very distant from the history. And so he wasn't looking for some kind of endorsement of any. And one of the things you have to be careful of with the famine and really almost anything to do with Ukrainian history is, people now want to use history to endorse contemporary political views and contemporary political arguments. And I tried to keep the book away from that as much as I could. And he was very sympathetic to that and very, urged, the whole time said, for example, I'm sure you'll want to talk about this too. When we got to the question of genocide, I kept whether or not the famine was a genocide, I kept that as a slightly separate issue, and I put it at the end of the book. Because although it's an important and significant question, it's not actually a question about the history. I thought it was very important to write a book about what happened. Here's what happened as best as we know based on what we can find. And then there's a separate argument. The question of genocide is a question, it's a judicial, political, moral, legal argument about the definition of genocide and what it was. And although that's an important conversation, it is slightly separate from the question of what was the Ukrainian famine and why did it happen. So I kept it separate. Another person who was really important to the book was Andrea Graziosi, the Italian scholar, who had done a lot of work on, also on this 1918 period, and who had thought a lot about precisely this issue. In other words, how did Stalin react to the revolt of 1918, and why that was important in shaping his view of Ukraine. And Andrea himself had never, he's a sort of very different writer from me, and he'd never really aspired to write a, sort of popular history of the Ukrainian famine. But he was extremely generous in helping me think through the periodization of it, in creating an outline, and thinking of what had to be involved, which, we talked a lot about the 1920s. And some of it, some of the structure of the book reflects his thinking, even though it's not necessarily in his scholarship, all of that. He was very useful. And then there were literally dozens of Ukrainian scholars, some of whom I've met. I met them at the archives, or I met them in Kiev, or I met them outside of Kiev, in Lviv, and some of whose work I read. And as I said, you can go through the acknowledgments in the book, and you'll see a list of all the great historians of the Ukrainian famine, all of whom, in different ways, were very helpful to me. And it really, as I repeat, it really is a book that was based on the work done by other people. There was a lot of work had already been done in archives. A lot of, there were also these massive collections of oral history had already been done. The fact that the Ukrainian, this is one of the advantages that Ukraine, having become a sovereign state, was that the Ukrainian state was able to commission these enormous memory books and these enormous collections of material and put them all together. And all of that was also extremely useful as well. I had another sort of research assistant in Kiev who was also helpful in a very different way, Tanya. Boryak, my God, I just had a little brain freeze. Tanya Boryak, who's the daughter of the Ukrainian head of the Ukrainian archives, who had done a lot of work on memoirs and was very interested in the pattern of memoirs and how they and what they showed about the nature of the famine, and her thinking about that as well. And so, generally speaking, I found that younger Ukrainian scholars were extremely helpful. I'm not being negative about older ones either. This is not an ageist presentation. But Tanya, who's also published a book, in the last couple of years on exactly this subject, her her thinking about what the memoirs tell us, what they reflect about how people explain the famine, what they reflect about the, she picked up very, I think, cleverly on, the constant, the language that people use about the perpetrators. So when activists came to the villages, what did they say to, how did they seek the grain? What did they say to people when they were collecting grain? And she saw, and she uses this as a way of, it's another piece of the proof that this was a deliberate attempt to starve people, because the activists, when they went house by house looking for grain, would say, they would shout at people things like, "Why are you still alive? If you're alive, that means you're guilty. If you're alive, then you've hidden grain." And so she picks this up very, very well. So there was a lot of, almost any scholar of the famine was helpful to me in one way or the other.
You mentioned that writing this book was really difficult, just emotionally getting into the subject. But also, when you were writing your book on the Gulag, you had intellectual distraction writing the cookbook in the same time. What
The
helped
cookbook
you?
was a distraction from the Iron Curtain book, actually.
Sorry. So what about the Holodomor? What distracted you? Because otherwise it's quite daunting.
Well, funny enough, when writing the Ukrainian, the Red Famine, there was this funny moment. I think this audience will also appreciate this. When I first went to my publishers who'd published my first two books, and I said, I want to do a book about Ukraine, their first reaction was, why? This is not an important subject. We don't, nobody really knew that much about it. Why do we need this book? These are my American and British publishers, and I sort of convinced them why I should do it and so on. They was, all right, okay, you can write this book, just don't take too long. And then, of course, and this is in about 2012, 2014, we have the invasion of Ukraine, and then they're on the phone, where is your book? Why isn't it out yet? Could you please hurry up and finish it? And then there was a completely different attitude. Okay, we take it all back. It's a really important subject. But the big distraction for the book, there was this funny moment when I thought, I can't finish my book on Ukraine because I'm really distracted by Ukraine. And the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, I did a lot of writing and broadcasting about that, the war, particularly the beginning of the war, from February to through the summer, partly because one of the things that I saw clear, this was very clear in London, which is where I was at the time, there aren't a lot of people, a lot of journalists who have a background in Ukraine. There are a few, and there are some very, very good ones. I don't want to undercut, but most of the people who were talking and speaking about the story were people who were Moscow correspondents. And they just didn't have the perspective of Kiev at all. There are many people who are more expert in Ukrainian politics than me, but I felt this sort of responsibility to Ukraine just because I knew a little bit of the history, I had a little bit of the background, and I felt this responsibility to talk about it a lot. And so I did lots and lots of television and debates and conversations about Ukraine, and that was probably my biggest distraction. Ukraine was my distraction from my book on Ukraine.
You're very modest because you did write a book on Ukraine in the past, in 1994. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
That wasn't just about Ukraine. So it is true that my very first book was not a history book. It was a travel book. It was a sort of piece of, artistic journalism or something, creative journalism. It was based on a trip that I did. The book was published in 93 or 94. But it was based on a trip that I did in 1991 from the Baltic to the Black Sea. I actually went from Kaliningrad to Odessa via, Kaliningrad district, Lithuania, the western part of Belarus, Minsk, and then through western Ukraine, and then out through Odessa. And then the book ends with a trip with a bunch of smugglers, actually, from Odessa to Istanbul, on one of those boats ferries that used to go back. They probably still go back and forth. And part of the book was about, so part of it was about Lithuania, but it was about this odd space in between, basically in between Poland and Russia, or in between Europe and Russia, and already what was happening in the region, which was the resurgence of national identity. I mean, that's really the main theme of the book. And there's a lot about Ukraine, and there's a particularly long section on Lviv, in which I spent a lot of time actually with a Canadian Ukrainian woman who was at that time investing in a hotel in Lviv, who I'm now still in touch with, oddly. I occasionally hear from her. And she was at that time, she made a big investment in restoring a hotel in the city of Lviv. This is Marta Fedoriv. And her various adventures in doing that. And eventually the hotel is stolen from her by a local mafiosi and so on. So it was a very 1990s kind of story. But that was but most of the book was an attempt to show that was really what is Ukraine for an audience who at that time really didn't know what it was. I mean, for lots and lots of people in the Western world, the Soviet Union was a whole red space on the map, and it was not divided up into republics. And so the difference between Russia and the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union and Ukraine and the significance of these various national identities wasn't very well understood. And so that was what my little travel book was about.
So your book came out 2 years ago. It's gotten a lot of press, a lot of reviews, and a lot has happened in Ukraine. And reflecting on that, are there things you would have done differently in the book? Things you would have focused more on, less on, clarified? Are there things you would have done differently?
I mean, so far, I don't think, there are things that are missing from the book that I would like to know more about. I mean, there are, the main one is to do with the fate of non-Ukrainian nationalities during the famine, and we've talked about that. I feel there's sort of a missing piece of research that I didn't really have time for, and that would be the one thing I would like to put it in. I mean, one of the things that for the most part, I mean, up until very sort of relatively recently, I was surprised by how relatively good the reviews were, in that this was a subject that would have been a few years earlier, I think, quite controversial, not just in Russia, for obvious reasons, but also even in the Western academic community. But I think partly the publication of archives and the resurgence of Ukrainian scholarship and people who had the Ukrainian voices in the Western academic community, I think had made a lot of mainstream Sovietologists or Soviet historians think a little bit differently about the period. And so there was a review that came out right at the beginning by Sheila Fitzpatrick, which had forgive me for kind of, summing it up, in a very brief way. I mean, sort of the issue at the subject, the thesis of the review was Anne Applebaum is a terrible person, and she, we really disagree with her views more generally about the Soviet Union, but her book about Ukraine is not bad. I mean, that was kind of the, and then she sort of disagreed, then we got into an argument about genocide, but that's neither here nor there. But that, and that was actually, Serhiy actually was the one, Plokhy was the one who pointed out to me that she had moved quite a bit on this subject, because she was somebody who very much didn't like the kind of conversation about nationalities. I mean, she saw the Soviet Union as a story about class. And her book she wrote actually a very good book, I think, about the peasants, in which she didn't make national distinctions between the peasants. And so the idea that pieces of the Soviet Union, were treated differently by the center depending on their national origin wasn't something that she had acknowledged before. And she seemed to in that review. She said, well, maybe there was something to that. And I didn't get the backlash from Russia that I expected. I didn't have it. No one attacked. I mean, they began to do it very much. I think when the book came out in Ukrainian, there began to be some of that. But initially, I expected a kind of, backlash, and I didn't get it. And mostly people were interested in the scholarship, and the reviews were, more, remember that this subject in the past, remember that Conquest book, when it came out in the 1980s, was treated by a lot of people as a kind of far right, you're indulging these Ukrainian fascists in their pretend view of history. And I really got almost none of that. I mean, people were open to the subject and the idea that it was, I didn't I didn't have this feeling that I'd missed some big thing in the book that needed to be dealt with.
What about perception of your book and reception of your book in other countries, in Spain? And I know you traveled in Germany with your book as well. Is different from English-speaking world?
So there are always some surprises. The book in Spain was reviewed by Mario Vargas Llosa, one of the great Spanish intellectuals, on the main sort of review page, of El País on a Sunday. So I mean, it couldn't have had a better, more prominent review. And Spain is a long way away from Ukraine, and not a country that is normally all that interested in Ukraine. And so in an attempt to explain why, I mean, for a lot of people, this was a new story. And if they knew something about the Soviet famine, they didn't know this aspect of it. And so a lot of the reviews, certainly in Spain, certainly in Italy, to some extent even in Britain and America, the reaction to the book was, we didn't know this, how amazingly interesting. And I think also because of the 2014 war and because Ukraine had been so prominent in the news, there was an interest in trying to understand the background of this country. I mean, I've had the experience in a lot of places. The one country that has always been a little skeptical of my books has been Germany, and this is because for Germans who have made it a matter of national faith that the worst thing, the worst crime of the 20th century was the Holocaust, they always find a little bit kind of walking on eggs to talk about Soviet crimes, and I found that with both my previous books as well. But I didn't have bad reviews there either. But there's always a little edginess and wariness of talking about the subject in Germany. I mean, it's actually coming out in France, I think, within the next couple of weeks. So I'll be able to report to you what happens there. And then the other place where it has done very well is in Scandinavia. A Swedish friend of mine likes to say that what happened in 1991 was that the Swedes woke up from their kind of Cold War stupor, and they looked at a map and they said, "Oh, look, we're very close to Russia." And there is a surprising interest in history books about Russia and the Soviet Union, ex-Soviet Union, in Sweden and Scandinavia more generally. And I get invited there to talk about the books. They sometimes become bestsellers there. The Swedes will buy long, thick history books about the Soviet Union in a way that other people won't. I mean, the Ukrainian response is also, of course, one of the most interesting. So I should say there's no Russian edition of the book yet. I've constantly lost track of the conversation about it. I think there's meant to be a Ukrainian publishing house that will do a Russian edition. Marta may know exactly what the stage of this is. There is, but whether it's actually happened yet, I don't know. The Ukrainian response was also interesting. I mean, it was also largely positive. I very warm reception by Ukrainian colleagues. I mean, I think because the book didn't do what some of because the book has a neutral, apolitical voice. There were some people who wanted it to be more partisan, and so I had that reaction inside Ukraine, that it is insufficiently, I don't want to say insufficiently nationalist, because that isn't even really the right word, but it's sort of insufficiently angry, or insufficiently about the greatness of Ukraine or something like that. So it had I had some, and I was actually surprised by some of the negative reaction in Ukraine. And actually the first time I thought that where some looked like some kind of Russian orchestration of commentary was in Ukrainian, which I hadn't really seen in English before.
I'm wondering if you could elaborate on one of the more academic criticisms. You've mentioned this in your comments, but I'd like to sort of draw that out, that there were famines elsewhere, right? There's a famine in Kazakhstan, there's the North Caucasus. This is a Soviet story of collectivization. Famine doesn't respect borders, right? And to sort of pull Ukraine out of context, doesn't quite tell the story right. Can you elaborate on your response to that?
So the way I look at the story of and this is the essence of why I wrote the book the way I did, was precisely for this reason. What was special about Ukraine and why was it unusual? And the way I look at it, and this actually is a metaphor that comes from Graziosi, who also thinks like this. When we can talk very generally about the crimes of Hitler. There were crimes of Hitler. He invaded Poland. He invaded France. He, murdered, people with mental illness, and we can talk in a general way about that. And then we can also speak within the big category of crimes of Hitler. We can also speak very specifically about the Holocaust, which even within this wide category had its own, its own direction, its own origin, its own sort of history, which is part of the crimes of Hitler, but is a slightly separate story. So my view is that there was an all-Soviet famine that begins with collectivization and is largely caused by the chaos and the decolonization and the breakdown of distribution systems that begins with that, and it affects every grain growing area of the Soviet Union, frankly. Within that bigger story of the Soviet famine, there are some different stories. There is a separate story of Kazakhstan, which my book is not about, but there is either is already or is about to be a good book about it.
Sarah Cameron's
book. I've seen the galleys of it. So, that is also a separate story. It may be that there is a separate story to be told about the Volga region, which was also a region, like Ukraine, was a region where there had been big peasant rebellions at the time of the Civil War, and which the Soviet leadership was paranoid about. So it may be that there is one could tell a slightly separate story there, but my argument is that there was a separate story in Ukraine. There's a different attitude to Ukraine, and then there's even a different set of laws and practices that apply to Ukraine starting in the autumn of 1932, and this is the set of decisions this is described in a chapter in the book. There's a set of decisions taken that autumn which apply either solely or mostly to Ukraine. And those of you who know the story will know that those are decisions about blacklisted villages. There are decisions about, there was a kind of cordon created around Ukraine so that nobody was allowed to flee. There were also, interestingly, decisions taken at that time about restricting, sort of recreating, sort of re-restricting use of the Ukrainian language and restricting Ukrainian culture. And also at the time of the famine and in the immediately afterwards, there's also an additional assault on Ukrainian culture, on the church, on languages, and there's a mass arrests of Ukrainian cultural figures, sort of poets, artists, et cetera, that is, and remember that that's an assault that is carried out by the same people who are conducting the famine at the same time. So by the people who were organizing it, it would have been seen as part of the same historical moment. So the argument is that Ukraine was treated differently, and there was a different intentionality towards Ukraine. And then the results, of course, are, there is no dispute about the numbers, which is that, the numbers of deaths in Ukraine are much higher, and they peak in the spring of 1933, which is, a couple of months after these new strictures go into place. So the laws go into place in 1932. A new set of collections and confiscation from the peasantry happens in the winter of 1932, 1933, and then this mass starvation comes to a peak that spring. And so you can trace the relationship between the spike in numbers and the decisions that are taken a few months earlier. And so that's my argument, is that Ukraine is, the reasoning behind the famine and the way Ukraine is treated is a little bit different from the way, Western Siberia is treated at the same time.
Shall we open to the floor now? So, questions? Anna?
Hi. I have a question about the conceptual boundaries of the term Holodomor as you see it. So you mentioned that Holodomor was unique to Ukraine as compared to other parts of Soviet Union because of cultural and linguistic oppression that was going on in combination with famine. So famine ended, but status and corpus planning and resettlements of Russian people that contributed to oppression of culture and language remained. So throughout the history of Soviet Ukraine. So my question is, do you see this term applicable to denote further Soviet policies towards Ukraine, or do you see it ending in this
Sorry,
particular
is
period?
what applicable to? I didn't quite hear
The
that.
term itself,
Which term?
Holodomor,
The Holodomor.
to denote the further scope of like future policies towards Ukraine after the famine.
So, I mean, yes, you're absolutely right that the repression of national identity in Ukraine does continue all the way actually until the end of the Soviet Union, and it takes different forms at different times. I don't think I would use the word Holodomor to describe what happens after the famine ends. I mean, it's a word that it refers very specifically to death by hunger, and although there are later famines. There's another famine that happens after the Second World War, and there are other periods when they're high. I mean, there's also, of course, the war itself which has different causes. But no, I don't think I would use the word after 1934. I think it's important to distinguish, to preserve nuances, and I think the famine was a very specific. It had a specific origin. It had a specific result. It ended. And that kind of policy wasn't repeated in quite the same way again. So I wouldn't use it. But I mean, the book is called Stalin's War on Ukraine, which some found to be a controversial title. And so the idea was that there was a war on Ukraine that begins in 1918 and you can argue goes all the way to 1991.
Hi, my question will probably be a little bit more political, if that's okay. Two questions, actually. Well, the first refers to genocide. The second refers to numbers. You mentioned actually about some research that has not been done yet with respect to the different national minorities and how they were affected by the events of 32, 33. 30 years ago, strangely enough, I was doing a history paper, BA history paper, and I actually did 6 interviews with Mennonites in the Waterloo.
Yeah, I have some. There are Mennonites in the book.
Yeah.
One of the
They stated that the Ukrainian peasants would come to them to get food. I guess the question is how much archival evidence. I mean, obviously that's hearsay from six eyewitnesses in Waterloo. How much archival evidence do we have of, in fact, this being something that was specifically targeted at Ukrainian peasants? And then the second question is very political, and that has to do with numbers. Because we've heard multiple figures, and we know that each time we bring up figures, we have all kinds of legends. 3 million, 6 million, 10 million. What conclusion did you come to?
So I'll say first about the numbers. There is only one set of numbers that are based on archival evidence. And this was a project that was done by Ole Wołowina, I'm pronouncing his name as in the Polish, sorry, but
Ole Wołowina.
Wołowina, okay. Wołowina would be how you would say it. And this was done by a team of demographers who went through not just, it wasn't so much famine material, but it was all kinds of records that were kept of population in small kind of regional and local population records. And they, based on what they knew about demography and about how many Ukrainians there should have been, they came up with the number. It's basically approximately 4 million deaths caused directly by the famine. And then you can sort of argue. Then they have a number I think it's 3.9 deaths, and then you can argue about whether you should also include the births that didn't happen and so on. But I mean that 4 million number is the only number that we have that's based on research. Okay, so there may be another number somewhere, but no one has proved it. And so the numbers that I use in the book are those. And this is a very high number. Some people would like it to be higher or think it should have been higher, but this is the only one we have. I mean, there are problems with the numbers. You know, we know that people were buried in unmarked graves without any records. We know that doctors were told at the time, this is all in the book. We know that doctors were told not to mark down the cause of death as starvation. You know, there's evidence of orders that were given to do that. So we know that there were attempts to massage the numbers. And then, of course, most famously, Stalin in 1937 conducts a census. The census, among other things that he didn't like about it, shows too few people in Ukraine. He thought there should be more people. And the census is repressed and never published. And then there's a false census published a couple of years later. So we know there was a lot of attempt to manipulate the numbers. And this is why the Demography Project goes back and looks at numbers going up to that time. And again, and particularly used evidence of things that nobody really would have bothered to fake, because it was just like when I did the numbers for the Gulag, there were some things that the state needed to know. You know, they needed to know approximately how many people were in the camp, because they needed to know approximately how many whatever pairs of boots that camp would need. And so the NKVD would have a need to know certain things. And so there's some numbers you can look at, and they weren't for publication, they were for their internal use, and you have to assume they're based on some real factors. And so that's the number that we have. And so I'm confident about that. I mean, the first problem, the one that you state, there is some material, actually, of the ethnic groups that lived in Ukraine at that time, the most material there is on the Mennonites. And this is because they kept their own records a little bit. And we know that they fared better than Ukrainian peasants, and we know that partly this is because they were able to get some help from outside. And we know that they fared better, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence about Jews. And the anecdotal evidence goes both ways. You know, some Jews may have starved, but it's also important to remember that the Jews at that time were much less likely to be peasants in the strict sense. So they weren't farmers. They were living in the countryside, but they were whatever, shopkeepers or tailors or cobblers or something else. So they were also therefore less likely to be affected by the famine. So, you know, but this is the piece of the story that I don't have. You know, I don't have any data about the Jews, and exactly what fate they suffered. And we know that some later on, you know, certainly there would have been Jewish deaths, because there were food shortages that affected everybody, including people in the cities. So they weren't an exception. But because the collections of grain were focused on people who were actually peasants living in the countryside, the vast majority of them were ethnic Ukrainians.
Paul? Yes.
Just a very brief follow-up on what you've just said in contrasting Mennonites, Jews, and then the vast majority are ethnic Ukrainians. The swath of land in the center of Ukraine from east to west, where the famine hit most, was also inhabited by ethnic Russians.
Well,
and how does
Russian
one,
speakers.
if one can, distinguish between those two?
I'm not sure that one can, actually. I mean, the other thing is, of course, the language spoken in those regions has changed in the last, not only because of the famine, but also because of changes over the last, 40 and 50 years. And it was, certainly at the time of the famine, it was much more Ukrainian speaking than it is now. I mean, the worst part of the famine is actually not in the east, but it's in sort of the area, not in the Far East, not in the Donetsk region, which actually did a little bit better because there was the Soviet state had an interest in keeping the mines and the factories in Donetsk going, and so there was food allocated to that region. But the center of the famine is Kharkiv and Kiev provinces, so sort of the central Ukraine, really, rather than the east. And at that time, it was mostly Ukrainian speaking. I mean, the question of who's these are, words. Who's an ethnic Ukrainian, who's an ethnic Russian, what exactly that means is, what is the genetic difference between Ukrainians and Russians in that region? I would guess none. So a lot of this is about what you identify as. But from the point of view of Moscow, those are, this is a territory of Ukrainian peasantry.
Thank you. Well, sorry, this is more of a personal comment. The extent of your versatility as a public intellectual is really quite magnificent, and it's truly admirable. I know that you've inspired so many people that come from a wide breadth of interests, whether journalistic or historical or political, amongst them many of my friends. And I guess what we would collectively be very interested in, as people who are very inspired by you, is to read memoirs of your life and your intellectual growth and evolution. And I know that in this book, which is your first,
That's my first book. Yeah.
yeah, you did reflect on your personal experiences as a human, but just would you consider writing memoirs in the future so that we could engage with you in a more intimate way?
Oh. I mean, so I am not so narcissistic as to think that that my autobiography would be of general interest. It's very sweet of you to say. I am writing a book actually right now, which is an expansion of an article that I published about a year ago in the Atlantic, which was an article that did have some of my personal reflections. It was mostly about Poland and Hungary, and my group of friends in Poland who've now gone in different political directions, and so the article was partly about them. And I'm trying to write a short book which will expand on that idea and include other friends of mine and other, mostly it's about what happened to the center right in several countries. And so that will have a bit of personal reflections on it. But I mean, you really don't want to hear about, my childhood in Washington, D.C. It's really not very interesting. But yes, this next book, if I do manage to finish it, which is right now unclear, because I'm finding it hard going, but will be a little bit more personal, and I'll take that idea into consideration.
Thank you. Could you please reflect a bit on your experience of writing a popular book on Holodomor in general, but also in general on violence, suffering, terror, dying, and actually not assuming that your audience knows things, not taking into account that you have to explain something to your general audience, and connected to that, did you get any feedback from a person without any academic background in history or Ukrainian studies? Please reflect on that.
So everything, I mean, it is true that, none of my books are supermarket paperbacks. Yeah. I mean, so, I will not deny, in order to even think about reading a book about the Ukrainian famine, you probably have to know some history. You probably have to have some, if you're an American or a Spaniard, or an Italian, you probably have to have some interest in the outside world, or at least in European history, if not East European history. So, I can't really pretend this is like, some kind of mass market writing, but I do try to write for, and I think often about who is my audience, and often I think because I have lots of friends who don't know much about Ukraine, or but they're intelligent people who would like to know about the world. So very often I think, if I was explaining this to a friend who is not an expert in Ukraine, or if I was explaining this to my sister, for example, sort of an educated person with an interest in the world who has no special background, what would I say? And so I very often think about who the audience is when I'm writing, as a way of, trying to figure out what I put in. I mean, for example, remember when I wrote about the Gulag, this came up, there was a thing where there was a reference somehow in the history of the Gulag to collectivization, okay? And so the question was, do I need to explain to the readers what collectivization was? And the answer was yes, because although, anybody who knows any Soviet history doesn't need to be told what collectivization is, I had to assume there were some people reading the book who might not know. And so to the extent that it's possible, I include explanations of things that, are obvious to experts. And you don't do that. You don't need to do that in an academic paper or an academic book, because your audience doesn't need to be told what collectivization is. that's a kind of example. I mean, I think actually as time goes on, I mean, I one of the things I would like to write, and if I do after I finish this short book, which talks about, people is a lot about people I know. I would like to write a book about 1989 and the 1990s, so the collapse of communism and what came immediately afterwards. And I have realized, partly in teaching this class of 19-year-olds, that I will have to, there will be some necessary explanation of what the Cold War was for a generation of people who don't know. And constantly thinking about who is your audience, what do they know, what is not obvious, is what I try to do. I mean, at the same time, these are, the story of how somebody starves to death and the personal descriptions that I put in the books. I mean, those are, I think they're of universal interest. And one of the reasons I use a lot of quotations from people, either that come from archives or stories from, in all three of my books, actually, all three of my history books. And the point of that is so that readers can identify with a story or a person, and it's not just a dry description of institutions. And by the way, this doesn't mean that I am at all negative about academic history, which I use lots of it. I work with academic historians. I admire them tremendously. A lot of them can do things that I can't do. So I don't mean to be negative. It's not negative at all. And there's definitely a space for a conversation among experts, in addition to a book that's outward facing. And I don't think all books should be popular. I mean, popular in the, in the sense of popular history. And I'm not blaming anybody for not writing them. Because they're, some conversations need to take place at a different level.
Thank you for this, and I've seen you present your book before at Columbia University, among other places, and so there's no need to congratulate you again on this major accomplishment. But so I'll just preface by saying that. But I think that I have a comment about why this matters in Soviet historiography, and I think that the differences between the 80s and now are just like, to a student of Soviet history, there's just no comparison in terms of agendas and in terms of the issues that matter.
It's because of archives.
Yeah, well, yeah, among other factors. But I think that the question of this ethnicity, did it matter? Did it not matter? This was something that was actually really debated openly in the 80s, and I think that today, the historiography has found that it mattered more and it mattered less in different kinds of ways. It matters more in the sense that there's just an implicit understanding among the field that the Soviet Union was not Russia, and that there were the nationalities. There's been an explosion of nationalities-related literature since the 90s. Obviously, and Ukraine is no exception to that. But there's also, it mattered less on the kind of day-to-day basis, too. We also have a much more subtle appreciation of how ethnicity functions in everyday life, right? That people, there was discrimination for sure, but there was a kind of sense that, in certain parts of Soviet society, that we're all in this together, we're all suffering, right? That there's a kind of, that there isn't necessarily, I don't know. So I guess in that sense, this national factor is not something that, is really like obsessed over anymore. And I think that your book really helps shift the focus from this like ethnicity qua genocide, right? That the implications of the ethnic focus is that there's the genocide question is at stake, and instead it actually shifts the focus to this political problem which faced the Soviet regime in these non-Russian areas. That there was a lot of, that it wasn't so easy. It wasn't so easy for them to set up the Soviet Union in these border regions, right? And so the politics of it, the context is really like important. For people to understand how the ethnic factor plays out here. And I think that's something that has really changed in the field. And so that's just a comment. So.
No, I really agree with you. And I think you're absolutely right. It's very amusing. I mean, Serhiy Plokhy, again, said to me that when he first came to Harvard, when he first came to the U.S., I'm not sure it was Harvard, and he came to the U.S. and was talking about Ukrainian history and the and he said nobody was interested in Ukrainian history, nobody cared about it. And then sort of 1991 happens, and then there's almost an overemphasis on it. And everybody wants to talk about it because, of course, nobody in most of the Western world knew there were these republics, or that there was any difference between Ukraine and Georgia and Azerbaijan. And so then there was a kind of overemphasis of, oh my God, we need people to explain to us his ethnic differences. Please, everybody, write as much as possible. And maybe that we're now in another cycle where we can as you say, we can understand it all and within a kind of different kind of perspective.
So thank you very much. So my question is probably also more of a political question, because you just mentioned earlier that you were trying to write this book as neutral as possible, and that you had this encounter with some Ukrainian historians, among others, saying that it didn't go far enough. And so I was wondering, what's your current perspective or your current view on what's happening in Ukraine right now as of its existing wartime memorial policy, and like how the topic of the Holodomor, like how that was included in that. So just giving the example of like Viatrovich, who was the head of the Institute of National Remembrance, and the way that he refers to the Holodomor. So yeah, I was just wondering whether you have any perspectives on that.
I mean, I'm reluctant to say anything really definitive yet about Zelensky and what his policies are, because I don't think we know enough. It's clear that I don't know. I don't want to say anything about him or what he's going to do that is going to turn out to be wrong. I mean, I think we are at a phase where the conversation about the Holodomor in Ukraine has gone through a certain cycle. And its importance in the 1990s was, it's an important episode in Ukrainian history which does unite people and doesn't divide them. And it had this function in the 1990s. And also because it was an attack on Ukraine, because people remembered it as an attack on Ukraine that was by the Soviet Union, that was hidden and covered up. It had this special power, and the memorials and this kind of every 5-year memorial cycle, and the conversation about it that made it so prominent actually in Ukrainian national politics and even international politics because of the genocide issue. It had a lot of salience and importance in the first kind of 20 years of independence. I have this slight feeling that partly because of the war in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, which is now an ongoing real tragedy, which is much more vibrant to people and has a lot more, it's more recent. It's not that it's worse or different or better, but it has, because of the war in Ukraine, the kind of the politics of history have a little bit shifted. And it's not that there's less interest in the famine, but as a source of controversy and anger and feelings about national identity, the war in Donbass is just more important now. And so some of the conversation about memorials and so on has shifted a little bit, and the emphasis has gone away from the Holodomor as this kind of central unifying historical story that everybody agrees about. So I think that's definitely a change. With the election of Zelensky is the election of somebody from, who is a native Russian speaker, but who is not, but who is also a Ukrainian patriot. So, and whose attitude towards these issues is going to probably turn out to be a little bit different from Poroshenko's, but also very different from Yanukovych's. I mean, I don't think he's going to be easy to classify. I mean, he's going to be somebody who wants, who wants a conversation about history that includes everybody and finds ways to include both the Russian-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians into a single narrative. What exactly that's going to be and how that plays out, I think we'll see.
Anyone from this side? Oksana?
Thank you. My question is actually heading in a similar direction, and I'm not sure whether you followed now the discussion in Germany. There is actually the question about recognition of Holodomor as genocide in the Bundestag, and there's this discussion, how political is this question, because the German-Ukrainian Historians Commission, they have certain attitudes about non-politicization of this issue, while there are different opinions on that. So as you were saying also that you were trying to be as impartial as possible towards politics while writing the book, how far, like, what is your opinion about the responsibility of historians on this question? Is it a political question or not, and how far is it important, the recognition?
What is the genocide
yeah.
question? So yes, it's a political question. I mean, I don't know, political is maybe the wrong word. It's a legal and moral question. It's a, I can tell you what happened, and then you can decide, you legal scholars, judicial scholars, and to some extent there's a political role, influence as well, what to call it. And was it like other things that are like that? So in my personal view, it was a genocide. I didn't have any trouble saying that. And I think it certainly fits very easily into Raphael Lemkin's definition of the word genocide, from his original writings about it. And it fits very well into the we're talking about state murder of citizens, because of who they are, and really also more than that. Actually, that was a bad phrasing. The attempt to eliminate a culture, because this is what Lemkin meant when he wrote about genocide. Not just, and he didn't mean, by the way, just physical elimination of people. He meant elimination of a nature, a culture, a nation. Attacks on churches, attacks on language, attacks on all of that you find very much in the story of Ukraine and Ukraine in Soviet history. It is true that after World War II, for a lot of people, the word genocide came to mean the Holocaust, and the definition of genocide was an attempt to murder every single member of a particular ethnic group. And that the Holodomor was not that. You can't say that Stalin was trying to murder every single Ukrainian, because that's not what it was. And that's sort of, and of course the Soviet Union had a great role in promoting this definition of genocide, and forcing, because the Soviet Union didn't want its mass murders to fall under this. It was useful for, and remember, the Soviet Union had an important role in creating these definitions, because it was one of the original founders of the UN, and it had a voice in all these UN conventions and in the international legal discussion of them as well. And so, unfortunately, there are a lot of people who think that's what the word means. My argument would be for continuing the conversation about genocide, expanding the definition, because there is something specific and different about it's not just crimes against humanity, it's a crime against a particular culture and an attempt to eliminate it. And I would preserve the original kind of Lemkinian definition of the word, and I hope that is eventually what will triumph. But do politics get involved in that conversation? Yes. Do some people in the Bundestag not want to offend Russia by saying this? Yes. Exactly the same conversation happens about the Armenian genocide. Do we call it that, or will we offend the Turks? Politics are inevitably part of the conversation, whether it should be or not. And you just have to, you can kind of look country by country and see what is. Very often the argument is as much about Russia and how we feel about modern Ukraine as it is about what really happened and what we call it.
My question is tied in with the last question, your response, and also what you said in the beginning, the reasons for taking up to writing the book. You mentioned that conquest, of course. Well, the challenge of the time when Conquest wrote his book was to decide or to show whether there was or there was no famine sponsored by the state, because it was denied by the Soviet Union. So that was the challenge. And the question of genocide was not really addressed by conquest, or very, peripherally at the end. By the time you were writing the book, the question of famine was already more or less settled. It was a question of expanding the knowledge about the famine and so on, and deciding whether there was a question of genocide in Ukraine. Now, the point of genocide is very important. It's tied to the Jewish identity, it's tied to the Armenian identity. The building of the state of Israel was very much tied to the question of genocide, called Holocaust. And the question of Ukraine also, by the time, as I said, you were writing, the question was to answer, was there genocide or not? Now, I think this is where the problem comes in. With your book, in the pages 349, those who have the book, and 350, check that. First of all, it has to come out from the definition of genocide in the Convention of the United Nations Convention. There is no talk about total destruction. By the way, the term is destruction, not killing. It's no talk of killing everybody. And the fact that Stalin didn't want to kill all Ukrainians is completely immaterial.
It's just what Anne said.
No, she didn't answer that. Wait a minute. My question is now, first of all, in the translations, this question is not, at least in the Ukrainian translation, this question is not addressed. My question is, will there be a updating, revised edition where you could bring in all the corrections? And I could go into a lot of other problems in that, but page 349, 350, if you want to discuss, we can discuss it. You've been avoiding discussion with me, but I think this has to be put out publicly. Either this is an academic discussion here, or this is just a mutual admiration society. Well, I want this to be academic. So I am open to discussion. Of course, we cannot monopolize it here, but I challenge you to continue discussion with me, and hopefully there will be a revised edition, because your story is beautiful, your material is good, but interpretation of some of the elements have to be revised to fit in. By the way, also with Lemkin, because for Lemkin, it was not just famine, it was, as you mentioned, all the other things. Thank you.
So first of all, of course, I'm not avoiding a discussion with you. I mean, we can discuss this afterwards right now if you want. I'm just telling you what reality is, that the term genocide, even today, means for a lot of people, the Holocaust. And I can, almost, an average person on the street, if you ask them what it means, that's what they'll tell you. And so the challenge for Ukraine is to overcome that, whatever's written in the UN Convention is to overcome that and say, there's a broader definition, and to explain to the world what it is. But I repeat, the point of my book was not to write about genocide. That was not what I thought the need for it was, and that wasn't, why I wrote it. I mean, the point was to make an argument about the nature of the famine and the degree to which it was targeted at Ukraine, this subject that I began with at the beginning. And really within Soviet history and within sort of general perceptions, the real issue is, and the real kind of challenge you have to cope with is precisely, I mean, for example, it's in Stephen Kotkin's recent biography of Stalin. The challenge that you're really facing is the one from the Moscow-centric historians who say there was one famine, it affected everybody. We agreed that it happened. Many people died, but there was nothing special happened in Ukraine. And that is not really, this isn't a question about the word genocide. This is a question of what actually happened. How did Stalin treat Ukraine? What were the events in Ukraine? What happened between, 1928 and 1935? Can you put it down? And what was, and where did, and how does that reflect Stalin's thinking? And so the point of my book was to address that, that prejudice and stereotype from the mainstream historians of the subject, writing in multiple languages. This is not just Anglo-American, but everywhere. I still maintain that the question of whether or not it was a genocide is a separate question, because that, depends on what you mean by genocide. And genocide is a legal, judicial category, and it is not a historical category. My book describes what happened and how it happened, and it is fully and 100% an argument that Ukraine was treated differently and specially, and that the point of the famine was to eliminate, or at least, what's the word I want, kind of mute Ukrainian national identity, and that is absolutely the central argument of the book. But the argument about whether it was a genocide I think remains a slightly separate subject.
Do you have a question from this side who hasn't asked a question? In the back?
So you mentioned that the center of the Holodomor, the hardest hit bits were sort of Kharkiv cave area. My question is, how affected were the areas that later became more Russified? So sort of the Donetsk and the Kuban regions.
I mean, they were all, so Eastern Ukraine was also affected. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. We can look them up afterwards. But yes, so, not so much obviously the city of Donetsk was not affected. And if the countryside was less affected, it was because a lot of people in the countryside had somehow contacts in the city, or someone in the family was working in the mines or something. And so that region is the death rates, and we have all the death rates for the region, and they're lower in the east. But yes, I mean people died in the cities as well. There was there were urban deaths during the famine because there were, one of the side effects was food shortages that affected everybody, even, everywhere. But yes, there are deaths in the east, and there are deaths in what were, what are now Russian-speaking areas. I mean, and somebody referred to this earlier, maybe it was you, somebody referred to it. There was, of course, famously, although it's unclear how important it was, after the famine, there was resettlement of those regions, and some of the resettlement came from outside Ukraine, and it was Russian-speaking. And so the region was partly Russified directly in the wake of the famine. It was probably more Russified in the subsequent
you're right
many,
about
50
that in the
years.
book.
So that's all in the book as well. This conversation about what happened to those regions and how they became more Russified. And the famine was one element of the Russification of Eastern Ukraine, but there were some other elements, including the war and then post-war migration.
You addressed that question because only 20,000 of those settlers actually stayed in south of Ukraine immediately after the resettlement. And you discussed that Russification happened actually after the World War II during the immigration.
A comment and a question that the number 4 million, what struck me was in those oblasts, Kharkiv and Kiev, which were then much bigger, they had part of Chernihiv and Poltava Oblast. It's the lower number, 4 million, is still 1 in 4 people living in the countryside. In rural Kharkiv and Kiev Oblasts died of hunger, 1 in 4. I think it's more like 1 in 10 in like Odessa, something like that. My question is, I would think the hope of an academic, of someone who writes a book like this, is to eventually change the way history is taught. Do you have any evidence yet about it getting into curricula, people using it in courses? How is that process?
This is absolutely, I'm hoping, this is what I want to have happen to the book. I want it to be used as an academic, in courses. The only anecdotal evidence I have, so Daria uses it in her course at Cambridge. But that's not a small thing. So Cambridge University in England, some of you will know, is, at least in Europe, is probably in Europe the most important center for the study of Ukraine and Ukrainian studies. So that's not a minor, achievement. The only thing I can tell you about the academic use of it is that I know that Penguin sends me these, these sales figures, and they give you, and there's a little chart, that shows, month by month the sale. There's a little zigzag goes up and down, and there's always this thing that goes way up in September. And I assume that's because people are buying it to use in their courses. And then it goes up again in January. and I have to assume it's the same thing for the last couple of years. So that leads me to believe that, yes, it's being used in courses. This September in particular, it went up. I mean, I'm not saying we're not talking about millions of copies, but still, it's somebody is assigning it to students who are all buying it in September, but why else would the number go up in September? So that's my guess.
Thank you. We're well into the questions, so now it's follow-up on questions that have already been posed. So I have two follow-up questions and a comment on one of them. Just now, the question was posed about how a book of this nature or the interpretation that you're putting forth reaches schools. I thought I heard schools, and yet your response to that was about use at universities.
Well,
Use
maybe
at
schools
university.
too. I mean,
Well,
I'm just saying,
I
all
get
I know is that the number goes up in September. So.
I think my point is that the most important thing are not universities. It's actually elementary and high schools. That's where historical memory is created in young people. So the real challenge of academics and people who write popular books is to get it into the elementary and high school curriculum. By the time people are in universities, they're lost. Their mind is fixed. So that is that's just an observation. One can agree or not agree. The other thing is just something on the genocide matter, less emotional. Your comments about here today and what you've done in the book is absolutely correct, and you've done it well and convincingly. That is, to the narrative of what happened is one thing. Genocide is the question of genocide is an entirely different subject, valid subject to speak about, but it doesn't have to be mixed up with the narrative. Absolutely correct. One little footnote, you just said, well, you know, today, popularly, when people think of genocide, if the man on the street will say, we'll link it to the Holocaust. Well, actually, we're here in Canada. And if you mention Holocaust here, they're going to link it to the native peoples. I mean, this is a big thing right now.
Apologize.
So, you know, it's not, we have to be careful about our generalizations.
Okay, all right. I apologize.
But no, not at all. The other, we all do it. I do it much more than you do, to one's chagrin. But in any case, on the question of genocide, I've suggested before and will suggest again. Actually, I find this argument about whether we can classify the Holodomor as genocide actually irrelevant in a very important way. If a state or a society decides to understand their historical past in the manner that they feel most appropriate, for whatever the reason, then that is it. I find it absolutely ridiculous that the state of Ukraine has to run around the world and beg parliaments and governments to give an imprimatur to their understanding of their history. So these debates in the German parliament right now, who needs this? If Ukraine has decided that this is going to be their historical narrative, that is the end of the story. Did the Armenians run around and ask governments?
Yes.
Or they shot people? They still, well, okay, fine. Good. You see, my generalizations are immediately corrected. The point is, Ukraine doesn't have to do it. If they consider it genocide, end of story.
I have some empathy for that. I mean, there is some truth to that. I mean, and it seems to me that then this will maybe get me in trouble with some people, but it does seem to me that the initial, beginning in the 90s, this initial drive to get Ukraine, the Holodomor recognized as a genocide, was somehow a proxy for getting Ukraine recognized as a sovereign nation. At a moment when, even in the 90s, people were like, what is this Ukraine? Is it a real country? Is it really different from Russia? Sorry? Well, I'm serious. And he's got that from Putin, and Putin says this at one of the NATO summits. He says this to Angela Merkel and George Bush. And so in this era when it's still Ukraine trying to establish that it's a real country, I think the getting the Holodomor recognized as a genocide was part of that national drive. And that was why there was a lot of, and the Ukrainian sort of diplomatic service put a lot of effort into it, and that was if it now seems to me, and again, people will correct me if I'm wrong, there's a little bit less emphasis on that, as Ukraine begins to have other interests in international relations. Now Ukraine, partly because of the war, Ukraine has a completely different set of goals internationally, and the question of whether the genocide is recognized has become a sort of secondary issue. It's sort of less important than it was 10 or 20 years ago, just because there are fewer and fewer people who question whether Ukraine is a real state, but there's a much more important question as to what Ukraine's borders are going to be, and is it going to be at war with Russia indefinitely, and so on. So the other things have pushed this out of the way. So that's my understanding of what's happened. As for the question of whether this book is read in schools and university, I don't think there are that many primary school students who are going to read that book. And even for high school students, it's tough. And so, what you're asking is whether this subject gets taught, in some other way, or excerpts from it are used or something like that. And that I hope they are. But and also, by the way, I actually do disagree with you. Having some contact with college students, I think lots of them change their minds at university. And, for many people, university is the first time you really do any real history. You've done sort of whatever, Canadian history or American history if you're American. And you get to university, and often for a lot of people, it's the first time you really properly encounter somebody else's culture. And I think people do change their minds and think differently.
On that very positive note of education and the power of education and reading and books and research to change minds, let's thank our wonderful speaker.